Please take this opportunity to silence your cell phones. We will begin momentarily. Please welcome co-founder and CEO of Poly, Samir Diwan, and software engineer at Intuit, Divya Rajuladevi.
Hey everyone, my name is Samir, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of Poly. And today's talk, we're going to go over building delightful experiences for large-scale organizations. Now, what does that exactly mean, building delightful experiences? For the purposes of this talk, we're going to break it down into two sections. One is taking advantage of the real estate that Slack gives us. What's special about Slack that unlocks these new delightful experiences? And the second is all the infrastructure and everything that goes behind it to actually deliver those experiences to the end user and the end customer. So Poly launched over 4 years ago, and that's a little crazy to think, realizing that the Slack platform is less than 4 years old. That was back when Slack had just over 100 employees. And there was no such thing as buttons, emojis, message menus, dialogues, modals, app homes. None of this actually existed because, again, there was no Slack platform. Now, Poly delivered a very basic polling experience back in May 2015, where you had to initiate a slash command. It would take you out to the web. And on the web, you'd fill in a form, and then you would submit that, pick your channel, send it over back to Slack, and it would get published into Slack as links to vote on. You click on a link, and it takes you back to the web. So you can see that bouncing around happening in a very basic and primitive experience, but that's all the real estate that we had. And that's really how most users actually know Poly, is the poll functionality. But the reality is, if you look at our customer base and how they use Poly, there is a level of sophistication that users and customers graduate to. They may start off with simple polling, where you may be doing something like figuring out what to prioritize, running a lunch poll, or just figuring out when we can meet. And it's a very simple experience, but it provides value to the end user. And lots of our users use it in that way. They can graduate to running things like company and team surveys, whether that includes running a daily stand-up right in Slack, using Slack's new modals and block hidden modals, or whether it's running poker estimation, running sprint retrospectives. It's a multi-question experience that happens right in Slack. And HR users can use it to gauge health of their employee or exactly how people are onboarding. There's various use cases where surveys and a rich multi-question experience that happens all in Slack takes place. There's also the ability to add use our webhooks, leverage our API, and add integration. So for example, you could take all the data that Poly generates and push it out to Tableau and build a visualization that actually allows you to act on the data that you gather. You can obviously do this in our dashboard as well, but there's various levels of power that our webhooks and APIs enable. Finally, there's this concept of a Poly survey workflow. Now, what is that? There's a lot of noise, good noise, around workflows, because there's things like Slack's own workflow builder, Zapier, Workato. There's an endless number of tools that allow you to automate various tasks. But how is that different from what Poly is capable of doing? Now, Poly Workflow is an automated and targeted way to gather critical data and insights from your team. And if you want to simplify it, it's basically part survey and part workflow. So the way surveys used to be done in the past, and even in the present to a large degree, is you have your 500, like if I wanted to survey this entire audience, I would write up my set of questions and send it out to everybody. Everybody would fill it out, and I would get the data back, and I would analyze it. And I'd be like, OK, here's what I learned by asking these 500 people exactly what they were thinking, how the talk went, what they liked, what they didn't like. Now, Poly Workflow starts with a trigger. And the trigger could be an external third-party application. It could be something that you've built internally. Or it could be something that comes from an event in Slack, for example. And then what it'll do is it'll target very specific people in your audience. So instead of actually targeting everybody, I may just target a handful of people who actually registered last minute because that's the kind of insight that I'm interested in. And then what happens afterwards is I can take a certain action based off of the data I get. So for example, if they gave poor feedback, I could go open up a ticket. Now, a single workflow captures this from just these 4 people. But if you tie it to an event, it actually happens multiple times. And the next time this trigger happens, it'll target a different set of users. And that's really the difference between a workflow and then a survey workflow. It's this continuous stream of data that you get. And a very practical application is around DevOps. So every time you have an outage, let's target the on-call engineers with exactly what happened, how severe the incident is, how closely we think we are to resolving it. But then target a new set of on-call engineers when it's a different product, a different incident, and we'll aggregate that data across all your outages. There's multiple applications of these workflows. You can use it to tie to IT help desk to get CSAT, customer satisfaction internally on your help desk. You could tie it to Jira and trigger sprint retros, and on and on and on. There's multiple layers of applications that you can bring to our workflows. Now, one of our customers is actually one that has gone through this maturation process in Slack. Starting way back many years ago using simple functionality in Poly, and then graduating to running surveys, leveraging integrations, and then doing really powerful workflows. So with that, I wanted to bring Divya Rajuladevi to stage to talk through some of her experiences working with Poly and Intuit. Hi, Divya.
Hey, hi.
Thanks for joining me today. So to kick things off, I'm sure people are familiar with Intuit and what it is about, but can you tell us a little bit more about Intuit and then the role your team specifically plays in Intuit?
For sure. Thanks, Samir, for inviting me over here. Intuit is a large financial software company. We are over 9,000 employees spread across 9 different countries, and we serve over 50 million customers. I'm one of the software engineers and also a Slack admin at Intuit. My team spends a lot of time thinking to build better tools to support our internal customer base.
So 50 million customers, that's quite a big undertaking. So what are some of the challenges that you and your team have identified in serving that very large customer base?
Customer support is the heart of Intuit's charter. Our support team uses over 20 different tools located across different locations where our products serve. In the past, there were dozens of tools. We were able to collaborate with the outsourced providers, but there was no much gain. So our leadership noticed that the siloed infrastructure was becoming a roadblock for the collaboration. And this is how we realized we need a platform for Slack.
So how exactly is Slack used to solve some of those problems? And then given the large scale of Intuit, what was the rollout like as you're trying to solve these problems?
Slack was rolled out by an internal initiative called Work Better Together and brought support teams, outsourced providers, and other Intuit teams together onto one common platform. Individual channels were created for specific product lines. We created dedicated space for our customer support representatives to ask support from the Tier 2 agents. This support helped agents and managers to have the transparency into the issues that were being brought up by the customers.
So obviously, since you're here talking about Slack and the rollout was successful. But as you rolled it out, how was the demand coming from all the other business units from the first unit that you may have started with?
Having over 9,000 employees, we normally have to be very deliberate and intentional about how we roll out a software. With Slack, we planned for a standard and a staggered rollout, but trust me, the adoption went viral. The IT teams and the Slack admins had trouble keeping up the demand from the business units to jump onto the Slack. Our MPS scores across the company were the highest for Slack.
So I mean, that's some of the stuff that we've heard, right? Like Slack rollouts going viral, lots of people adopting it, and that's great. But why do you think it was specifically successful at Intuit? What did it actually unlock for your employees and for the team?
Slack helped us realize new opportunities to increase productivity. This was on a large scale, including training on simple intuitive workflows that were easy to use and also automate some manual and tedious tasks.
So can you give us some examples?
Of course. One of the examples is the workflow we built using emoji reactions to facilitate our customer support interactions. Earlier, I had mentioned that our support teams have created dedicated channels for our Intuit various products like QuickBooks, etc. These channels are a platform for our Tier 1 support agents to help on the issues they need to escalate with. They typically post a message when they need additional help with. The Tier 2 agents indeed are monitoring these channels and will use an eyes emoji to claim that they're actually working on it, and also let the other users know that they're actually working on it for the visibility purposes. The agents will discuss the issue within the thread. When the Tier 1 agent feels like that the issue has been resolved, they will react with the checkmarks emoji, communicating to the rest of the channel that the issue has been resolved. This workflow perfectly ties back to our work better together attitude. These discussions were previously buried in private email exchanges. By bringing this workflow into a channel, we created multi-layers of transparency. Managers can quickly identify unresolved issues, and they can say thousands of interactions that takes place and see whether they're able to see for everyone. So there is full transparency.
So that's a really great use case, and this is where Poly and Intuit start to come together, and our use cases or our workflow starts to overlap.
That's correct. As we invested more heavily in Slack, we naturally started to look at the Slack platform to see where we could leverage third-party applications to continue our help to work better together. There were already a few teams using Poly for simple polling on and off use cases. So that is where we started talking to you and about running some complex surveys to support the escalation process.
So as Divya mentioned, that's really when Intuit came to us, and the specific ask they had was this was the process they were running, this was the workflow. But how could they get more meaningful data and actionable insights from what they were doing? And how could we make this process even more automated? So going back to that check mark that's added, what we did was, using our Poly survey-based workflows, you can tie the triggering of a survey to an emoji reaction being added. And so in this case, what we would do is we would specifically go target that Tier 1 agent. And that Tier 1 agent would then get a survey every time that checkmark emoji is added. And that's, emojis might have started very simple to speak to your emotions, your reactions, a light way of doing that. But this is an example of adding meaning, structure, and really powerful workflows to Slack using, in this case, Poly. So the survey then goes out to the Tier 1 agent, and they get the survey. And in this specific example, they're evaluating that experience with that Tier 2 agent that helped them. Now, Intuit asked us to make this powerful. So what we did was that eye emoji and that checkmark emoji, we actually captured the timestamp of those reactions. And then we actually bubble up as both a metric and as a visible thing into the survey exactly how long it took to resolve the ticket. And that does two things. One, it actually gives the survey taker some context when they complete that survey. When they're answering those questions, here's the agent that helped, here's how long it took. It actually gives them that context, and then that data becomes available to them on the back end when they're analyzing the data. Now, all of this falls off if the experience of giving that feedback isn't straightforward. And it's super straightforward when you do get that set of questions. Really quickly, using BlockHit in modals, you can instantly complete those 2 or 3 questions, give that feedback, and now give management the insights to be able to act. So that's a quick overview of when Intuit came to us and how we solved that problem. And that problem now, that emoji reaction survey workflow is available for everybody to use in our Poly plans. So Divya, what were some of the wins that you saw when amplifying that existing emoji workflow by adding Poly on top of it?
UZ polling in Slack took an existing process to another level of automation and efficiency. It also gave support agents and the managers an opportunity to learn. Now that tier 1 agents, when they were dissatisfied, we could exactly go chase down to the issue they were referring to and look into the discussion thread and see what might have even gone wrong. It took the transparency to another whole level. Ultimately, this helped us deliver better to our end customers.
So now after this happened, Intuit came back to us. So they used this process for a while, and they said, all right, how do we take this to another level? How do we keep going? And that's when we partnered, working with Intuit, bringing in another third-party application in the Slack ecosystem, Spoke. And we powered this incredible workflow that I'll go through with Poly, Spoke, Intuit, and the Slack platform. And really the way that worked was, instead of now escalating in a channel directly to a tier 2 agent, it would ask the Spoke bot to try and auto-resolve commonly asked questions. And only if Spoke couldn't auto-resolve it by looking in its knowledge base and repository, it would then reroute to a ticket that a tier 2 agent would service. And now it would go to a human. So essentially what we were trying to do in this workflow is eliminate some of that initial manual things that we could resolve easily. The same process then happens, but the execution of it is actually a little different. So when the tier 2 agent resolves the issue, now it uses a Spoke webhook to call into the Poly API. And so again, this is an example of two independent third-party Slack applications coming together to provide a unified experience. And the cool thing about this webhook is that Spoke can pass in a bunch of data from the ticket itself right into Poly. And so that information carries through the entire workflow. And then we can use that, again, to serve up the survey and then make that data available on the back end. And this entire process comes together to provide, again, an amplified workflow. And we expect Intuit to keep pushing us and keep pushing the Slack platform. So Divya, it's great to see Intuit pushing us and pushing the Slack platform. Any final thoughts on the platform, Poly, and your experiences working with us?
Yeah. Slack is one of the best collaboration and productivity tools at Intuit, building internal and external application. It also integrates great with the third-party application Slack and Poly. So this suffices our win-together mindset. Thank you for sharing this opportunity, and it's an honor to be here to speak about the astounding Slack and Poly integration.
Thank you, Divya. Appreciate it. So what we'll do now is transition from the experiences that we built with Intuit and other customers that jump on very similar scenarios, and talk about the infrastructure that it takes to actually support and deliver these kinds of experiences. So just in this Intuit interaction that we talked about, in a 1-week period during tax season, over 40,000 exchanges are evaluated. That's a ridiculous amount of exchanges, with over 3,000 support agents participating. And Slack has been talking about the deep level of actions that people have with their platform. Over 1 million actions are happening in just this experience over a 1-week period, which is insane when you think about it. This really pushes both what Poly and what Slack can do from a platform perspective. And really the 4 things that we're going to dig into to talk about how we support this infrastructure, these scenarios, is how we work in enterprise grid, because Intuit leverages grid, how we deal with rate limiting, the infrastructure that's needed to support this kind of an experience, and then the security requirements. So let's start with enterprise grid. There's been a lot of talk at Spec about shared channels, and we've actually had to be dealing with this over the past couple of years with Intuit as a customer. And so when that user actually asks Spoke in that example that we went over, it's pretty straightforward. We'll call the users.info API, and we'll get back exactly what the user ID is, and then we'll use the user ID to go pull up the information to send that user that very specific question. The only challenge is, in grid, you don't always get that. So when we call conversations.open, we'll get the user, but we won't necessarily, we have to open a channel, and in order to open the channel, we need to know who the user is. And that requires chasing down exactly the user ID. And if Poly's in that channel, then we send that survey via DM to that channel. But in grid, what ends up happening is this user isn't necessarily just part of a single workspace. So when it goes to the Spoke web app, from there, what ends up happening is Spoke calls with a webhook. And from there, from Spoke, we only get a user email address. And we need to reconcile that email address to a Slack user. Because in most experiences, it's a Slack-based interaction. But in this example, it isn't. It's coming from a third-party application like Spoke. And Spoke doesn't have the user ID. They're just sending us the email address. And then when we try to look up that user, we're like, hey, this user, Maisie, not found. But what happened? That whole interaction used to happen in Slack. Why can't we find that user? And the reality is because this user is part of multiple workspaces. And some of these workspaces, there's Poly installed, and in some of them, there isn't. And in other ones, that user is not even part of that workspace. And Poly may be installed in that workspace. The challenge is that apps are installed on a per workspace basis, even in Grid. And so a token is actually associated in this example with a workspace where Maisie doesn't exist. And if Maisie doesn't exist, how am I going to get Maisie's user ID based off of email? Because based off of that email alone, I can't actually reconcile it. So what we do, when the user's not found, is we actually hack this whole process. And what we'll do is we'll look at every other Grid workspace where Poly's installed for that grid. And then we'll just keep cycling. We'll say, is Maisie in this workspace? No? OK, keep checking. Keep checking. We know that those workspaces are linked by over here the enterprise ID. So we can tell where Poly's installed. And based off of that, find and weasel our way to the end user. And the funny thing about this whole experience is the first time we had a customer that this all broke apart with, it was Slack trying to use one of our scenarios. So it's just another example of Grid. You have to be aware of how people are using your product and how you can navigate to actually deliver that good experience. The next thing that we run into for an organization as large as Intuit with 9,000 employees is rate limiting. So with rate limiting, let's first get on the same page with what we mean by rate limiting and in the context of this talk. One is rate limiting is different for different methods in the Slack API. So it's not always the same. The different methods that we showed, some of them have a certain level of rate limiting, some have another, and some have no rate limiting at all. And rate limiting actually ignores your workspace size. So if you're a small company like Intuit with 24 employees, if you're a small workspace like Poly with 24 employees, or a large workspace like Intuit with 9,000 employees, the rate limits are exactly the same. So it's on a per method, per workspace basis. It doesn't matter how many people are part of that workspace. The other thing with rate limiting, it works in a leaky bucket manner. So while there is steady state rate limiting, you can fill the bucket with a flood of API calls first until the bucket's full, and then you have a certain level of rate limiting. So now, let's go through an example of rate limiting. So let's say you're the CEO of a company, of a 2,000-person company, and you want to send a survey at the end of your all-hands meeting. That is basically the first drip. So now, because this is a pretty serious survey, I actually want to send it by direct message. I don't want to post it in channel. I want to target every single user. So this actually calls a number of Slack API methods. And what you see here on the slides is you see the rate limit that's applied on some of these methods. So that's the first drip in the bucket, since I'm trying to send it via DM to 2,000 people. Now people start voting with buttons. 2,000 people are all clicking on buttons. Now I got to process all of those rate limits. At Poly, we like to update our results in real time to make it feel alive. Again, take advantage of the Slack real estate that we're given. So every time somebody clicks a vote, we go update the other 2,000 messages with what the current results are. Again, more rate limiting. Now, when we hit rate limits, we can't actually update. So people click a button, they don't see any response. And fundamental UI, you click a button, you should see something happen. So when they click and nothing happens, they click more, and they just keep clicking. They keep clicking, and more rate limiting happens. And we just get in this downward spiral of unable to process all of these events. And then the author, so the CEO or the assistant to the CEO is super frustrated. It's just like, this thing's terrible. We got to delete it, get it out. Everyone's complaining. This all-hands meeting is a disaster. They tried to delete it, but guess what? We're under rate limits, so they can't delete it. Now, this is an example of what happened with an actual CEO on stage, a public company, trying to send an all-hands meeting survey at the end of their all-hands. And all hell broke loose. So how do we resolve that? What do we do? That was a good lesson for us, and also a good lesson for Slack. So the first thing we did, we talked to Slack, and they very quickly eliminated rate limiting when using the response URL. So when somebody clicks a button, there's no rate limiting. We'll respond. Somebody clicks on a UI element, you got to respond to them. That was fixed very quickly after we escalated that issue. The second was, rather than look this stuff up in real time, we already know that people are going to want to send these kinds of things out. So well in advance, what we do is we actually start caching some of this user information that we would need to pull when they send those surveys. So an async user and channel sync. So we figure out what the user is, what the channel is, and we eliminate some of that lookup that we would have to do on the fly. So when they do send that survey out, it isn't hitting those rate limits. The next thing that we do, but one other thing that adds is that actually, while we're doing that sync, we have to make sure we don't hit rate limiting. But that happens in the background, so it's a little easier to process slowly. The other thing that we do is stagger delivery. So if you're going to send something out to 2,000 people by DM, we'll actually spread it out so it doesn't hit rate limiting very quickly. And that thing I talked about with updating the results in real time, we like that feeling of rich real-time experience that we deliver to our users. It's actually an exponentially complex problem, because every time somebody votes, 2,000 updates. Second person votes, another 2,000 updates. 2,000 people vote, a ridiculous amount of updates. So what we decided to do, again, is batch those requests. So if multiple people click, we'll group them together. That's the first thing that we did. The second is we built a throttling module, which actually logs and tracks updates that we do to the message. And very simply, what it does is we process all of these requests on an SQS queue when we go update to the end user. We actually just check. So we have a bunch of clicks coming in, let's batch them and let's check. Should we update? You know what? We haven't updated the UI in a while. OK, just send it through, and we'll go update the UI. If we have seen updates, we'll actually time it. So like, OK, we're going to send this update, but let's send it out a few seconds later. That, again, avoids the rate limiting. And because we may hit the incident of people clicking multiple things, we basically auto-detect if people are doing duplicate requests. And if we see duplicate requests, we just throw them out. And so those are some of the small things that we do, which hopefully prevent the author getting to a frustrated state where they need to delete the survey. And that's a complex way of managing rate limiting for large-scale organizations. And this is a thing that we see time and time again. And because of that, when we hit rate limiting, if we processed everything on a single AWS SQS queue, what would end up happening is we would be flooded with requests that all our customers and all our users would be on at the same time, and one customer would then be able to bring down every other customer. So we actually are a little proactive with that. What we do is we actually split things out into various queues. Anytime somebody's sending a survey out by direct message, we proactively isolate that to a separate queue. And that's because it's more prone to rate limiting, more prone to errors, and if errors happen there, we want it to be isolated. The next thing that we do for our large-scale customers, we actually give them their own priority queue. And that's just a way of delivering extra level of service to the largest Slack customers, because that ensures they have a good experience. Again, delightful experiences isn't just about UI, isn't just about the value prop, it's everything under it that actually allows them to go and do their job, not noticing all the infrastructure underneath it. And that's one small thing you can do to support really large-scale customers. The other thing that we do is we take the Events API and we put it on its own queue. It's an asynchronous thing that we don't control, that Slack sends us updates for. Because it's not controlled by us, we want to just isolate that as well. And then we put everything else on another standard queue. So that's what it takes from an infrastructure perspective. Now, from a security perspective, we've been talking a lot about reduced scopes and granular permissions for applications. That's a huge win for us. And that's because having access to customer data is a big deal. It's the cause for people going through ridiculous amount of security reviews, and they should be concerned when you have their data, because their data in many cases is proprietary, is secret, and leaks can be very, very costly. So the best way to, as my co-founder said at the keynote, the best way to be secure is to not actually have that data. So what we like to do is request the least amount of scope as possible and only ask for more scope if it's needed to produce that functionality that they're chasing. The next thing that we do is encrypt. Encrypt everything, including your bot token, so you don't accidentally expose it on GitHub when you're asking the community for a problem. Internally, we run really strict process, and that's essential. So audit everything, update everything, just be on top of all the tools you use and the process that you implement. And finally, it's basically to go chase some of the certifications that Slack does. What we like to do is follow Slack's lead. Whatever Slack's doing, their customers are going to ask us for, so it's a good level of guidance to just follow in those steps. So really, that's all the things that are needed to support these kinds of customers. And I spoke about Intuit with Divya, but there's a bunch of other applications that we have. And it really takes advantage of not just, again, running a lunch poll, but taking it to the next level, leveraging integrations, and then building automation around what we call surveys. But really, when you target people, when you make it automated and targeted and dynamic, it's a completely new experience. Thank you. And if you have any questions, if you haven't already submitted them on Slido, feel free to do so now. With that, I'll bring Divya back on stage in case there's any questions that you wanted to address with her as well. So Divya, you can join me back on stage. So any questions? Let me see if... I'm not sure if I see anything, but are there any questions that I can field from the audience? If not, we're always available to come chat with afterwards. Anything?
Looks like the session is clear so far.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.